Mandy Simon's with us today. She is professor of philosophy at Carnegie Mellon University, and she holds a PhD in linguistics from Cornell. She has a distinguished career researching how meaning is conveyed via natural language use in the fields of formal semantics, pragmatics, and philosophy of language. In the last decade plus, this has especially included research into presuppositions and projective content more generally, charting out how different kinds of projective content work within the larger architecture of interpretation. She's published on these topics and others in many distinguished journals, including most recently in Philosopher's Imprint, Annual Review of Linguistics and Language. And she will be presenting joint work today with Craige Roberts on preconditions and projection. And we also will have a commentary from Florian Schwarz. He is Associate Professor of Linguistics at the University of Pennsylvania and holds a PhD from UMass Amherst. Florian specializes in theoretical semantics and pragmatics, as well as psycholinguistic investigations of phenomena in these fields. And we're very grateful to have him here to provide a commentary. So please join me in welcoming our speaker.
First, let me say thank you first to Manfred for the invitation, and thanks to Dan for that lovely introduction, and thanks to everyone for coming. So, as has already been said, this is joint work. Also, let me say in advance, thanks to Florian for agreeing to be the commentator. So this, what I'm going to present here is joint work with Craige. This is work that we sort of began for earnest when I was on sabbatical in New York last spring, but in some sense it represents conversations that we've been having, for a decade. So it's very, it's exciting for us to finally sit down and try to work out these ideas. So let me just get a timer going. So this is what I'm going to try and do today. I'm going to lay out an account of the projective behavior of three classes of what we call projective background contents. Two of these classes are familiar. The veridical implications of factive clauses. So from Jane doesn't know that Strasbourg is in France, the implication that Strasbourg is in France. The second case are the pre-state implications of change of state clauses. So from Jane didn't fall off the ladder, the implication that Jane was on the ladder. The third class that fall under this account are cases of the selectional restrictions of verbal predicates. This is a class of projective contents that is less discussed in the literature. So for example, the implication from the robot didn't kick the tree to the observation that the robot has a leg or a foot. There is three components to the account that I'm going to lay out. We start by characterizing the implications of interest as what we call ontological preconditions of the event types characterized by the verbs. And I'll explain that in detail in part one. In the second part, we offer a partial account of why these implications are projective at all. That's part two. And parts one and two together kind of constitute a triggering account for the implications in question. In the third part, I'll turn to the question of when and why these implications fail to project, including in the standard cartoon and filtering environment. So parts 2 and 3 together kind of constitute a projection account. But it's really crucial to what we're doing that these three things all work together, and that the projection account is sensitive to the nature of the source of the implications. Just to be very clear about the scope of the account, this is proposed only for, as I've called them, projective background contents. This is the class of contents that in the joint paper with Judith Tonhauser and David Beaver and Craige, we call the class C contents, not a very descriptive term. So all of the cases that we discuss are cases of class C contents. We think that the second part of the account, the projection part of the account, can be extended to class C broadly, but that modifications are needed to the relevant notion of precondition to extend it beyond the cases that we are talking about today. So what we mean by projective background contents, the properties that the contents in question have are these. First, unsurprisingly, they're projective. Second, crucially, they do not impose constraints on the prior context. In other words, they're felicitous when they're informative. And this makes them distinguishable from anaphoric projective contents. So really the claim here, although it is typically assumed that in much of the literature, that any projection trigger has this anaphoric nature, various people have failed to find evidence for this kind of constraint, anaphoric constraint, for the cases that we talk about. Finally, the contents that we talk about are locally entailed, meaning they are obligatorily true in the scope of an immediately dominating operator. And finally, just to clarify what we mean here by projective, we adopt a fairly standard now account that to say that something is projective is to say that it tends to be understood as a commitment of the speaker, even when associated with material under the scope of an entailment cancelling operator such as negation. Let me say a few brief things about what motivates the work that we're doing here. The motivations for a triggering account, I think, have been discussed quite a bit recently. One way to go, kind of a standard, at least sort of default position often taken, is that presupposition or projective contents are simply encoded as such in the lexicon. But we all observe systematicity both within languages of the projective contents of classes of predicates, and we see this same pattern occurring across languages. So there's just this very strong suggestion that there's something systematic about what projects given a particular trigger. Some newer work, experimental work by Goodhue et al. Demonstrates triggering from novel and non-linguistic signals. Again, kind of suggesting that there is something general to say about the basis of projection, rather than saying that projection is something that's lexically encoded. So that's why we think we need an account of triggering. What about a revised account of projection? I mean, we have some very good projection accounts out there. Because we feel confident that the contents we're talking about are not anaphoric, or not subject to any contextual constraints, we need an account that is not based on that assumption. And most of the accounts that we have out there do make that assumption, hence we try something different. Okay, so let's get into the meat of things. The first idea is that the projective contents we're interested in are what we call ontological preconditions of event types. So to develop this notion, we borrow from the philosophy literature the notion of ontological dependence, which is a relation that holds between an object or eventuality and the objects or eventualities on which its existence depends. So let's start with a simple example, a standard example from the literature. The notion of rigid ontological dependence exists between two specific objects. So it's observed, for example, that sets ontologically depend on their members. That means that a given set can only depend, its existence depends on the existence of its members. The set containing Mandy Simons can exist is ontologically dependent on the existence of Mandy Simons. But we can generalize this notion of dependence to what is called generic ontological dependence, which is the case where the existence of some object A requires the existence of something of another type, call it F. So, canonical example of this is that electricity ontologically depends on electrons. You can't have electricity unless you have electrons. But it's not that electricity requires the existence of this particular electron, just requires the existence of some electrons or other. So this is a notion of generic ontological dependence. We push this notion to a further level of genericity. So let's start by thinking about the ontological preconditions of specific events. Consider a specific event E of Jane leaving the house. That depends for its existence on the existence of some state E prime of Jane being in the house. It doesn't require the existence of any specific state of Jane being in the house. It doesn't matter if she was in the kitchen or in the living room, but she has to have been in the house in some state in order for the event of her leaving to take place. So this is a generic, not a specific dependence. But now we want to generalize even further beyond that to things we can say about any event of leaving. So in general, any event E of any agent leaving a location depends on the existence of some state E prime of the agent being at the location. And this gives us our notion of an ontological precondition of an event type. These are the objects or event types on which any event of that type is generically ontologically dependent. So I know that's a lot of words, but I think the intuition is pretty straightforward. What's required for any leaving event to take place, for example? So our claim is that the projective contents of interest here in the talk reflect ontological preconditions of the event types denoted by the triggering predicate. And one very clear example of selectional restrictions of predicates of ontological preconditions come from the selectional restrictions of predicates. So we already talked about the example of the robot kicking the tree. So it is clearly a selectional restriction of the use of the verb kick that the agent is something that has a foot, because you can't kick something unless you've got a foot or a leg. And this, we note, is also a fairly robustly projective implication. So if I say the robot didn't kick the tree, still think it has a foot. If I ask, did the robot kick the tree, there's a suggestion that it has a foot. This is an instance of a selectional restriction on the subject. We also see these kind of restrictions on the direct object. So if I tell you Jane smashed the davdoodle, you don't know what a davdoodle is, but you can infer from me telling you this thing in 4 that the davdoodle is made of brittle material, something that's smashable. And the same implication arises if I say Jane didn't smash the davdoodle, or I ask, did Jane smash the davdoodle? Again, the material property of the object is an ontological precondition on any event of smashing. So we want to emphasize that this relation of ontological dependence is indeed ontological and not semantic. This isn't a property of words, but a property of the events characterized by those words. And moreover, ontological preconditions are preconditions on the existence of events and not on the truth or falsity of sentences expressing those events. However, ontological dependence does have semantic consequences. Specifically, if we have a sentence S1 that describes an eventuality of type E, we have another sentence S2 that describes an ontological precondition of this event type, then we will have entailment between these two sentences. But of course, not all entailments of a sentence describe these event type preconditions. So if I tell you the robot, so the sentence, the robot kicked the tree, entails that the robot has a foot. Sentence S3 is a further entailment of S1, but this is not an expression of a precondition of the event type. So one of the important conclusions here is that not all entailments are of the same type. Because there are semantic consequences for of ontological preconditions, we can find sort of rough linguistic diagnostics that distinguish between precondition type entailments and other types of entailments. And I'm going to illustrate fairly quickly these two types. The first involves the connective which allowed for. So I can, if I say Jane was on the ladder, which is part of what allowed for Jane to fall off the ladder, this seems true. And notice that the first clause is intuitively a precondition of the event described at the end. If I change to a different entailment, one that doesn't seem to be a precondition, the truth judgment changes. So that's in 2. Jane was off the ladder, which is part of what allowed for Jane to fall off the ladder. We include this as part because at least for some speakers, and this is the difference between me and Craig, the allowed for has a kind of exhaustive reading, and if that's how you read it, then you're going to need that addition in parentheses. So this is just clarifying the structure of that diagnostic. The thing at the end is the trigger, and the clause at the beginning is an entailment. And the idea of the diagnostic is simply that it allows us to distinguish between different types of entailments. The second diagnostic that we are using involves a counterfactual. So we look at the sentence in 1. If Jane hadn't been on the ladder, it wouldn't have been possible for Jane to fall off the ladder. People find this to be true, as opposed to 2. If Jane hadn't been off the ladder, it wouldn't have been possible for Jane to fall off the ladder. Seems to be false. And here again is the structure. We have the entailing or triggering clause at the end with the antecedent containing the negation of the entailment. I'm not going to go through all of these examples in detail, but these, I'll let you look at this. These illustrate that preconditions and non-precondition entailments of related to selectional restrictions seem to behave nicely also in these diagnostics. And sentences 1 through 4 here illustrate the same idea with the veridical entailments. I'll just give people a moment to look at the examples. And we can talk about these in more detail in the discussion period if you would like to. I want to be sort of upfront about the fact that the diagnostics don't always work as well as we would like them to. It should be noted that these are they're not linguistic diagnostics in the normal sense, in that changing when we change which entailment we have, we get judgments of a change of interpretation, or one is grammatical and the other isn't. We're looking at judgments of truth and falsity. I think in the what allows for test, the judgments are not always that clear. In the counterfactual case, we find that where we have a non-precondition entailment that characterizes some essential part of the event time, if the antecedent and consequent are interpreted as cotemporal, then we still seem to get true readings. And we can avoid that by changing the form of the sentence to avoid this cotemporal interpretation. But this is something that we're still trying to work out and tweak. And Craig may have more to say about this when we get to the discussion. Okay, but I would like to move on. So just summarizing what I've said so far, projective background contents of change of state predicates and factives reflect ontological preconditions of event types. And this seems to be true of selectional restrictions of verbs generally. So what do we get out of this? Well, this isn't yet a projection account or even a triggering account, but it's a classification of contents for which a projection account is needed. So the next question then is, why do preconditions project at all? So I want to start with what I take to be a related phenomenon. So imagine A and B are they're on vacation, they're making a plan what they should do that day. A says, what should we do today? And B says, well, it's going to rain. So standard kind of relevance implicature case. But to derive a relevant interpretation for B's utterance, A has to attribute to B some background assumption about a relation between rain and possible activities. Right? So, and this isn't hard, right? We think, well, B probably has in mind that, you know, we don't want to do things outdoors today if it's given that it's going to rain, right? So the background assumption is outdoor activities are not good in the rain. An observation I made a long time ago, and similar observations have been made by Neri Kadmon, is that this background assumption, the requirement for the background assumption, is shared across the standard kind of projection or family of sentences responses. So if B had said instead, well, it isn't going to rain, B is still taken to be assuming some relevant relation between rain and what we should do today. Similarly, if B says, well, it might rain, or asks, is it going to rain? For this, the questioner, A, to make sense of any of these responses, they have to attribute to the speaker the assumption that some relation holds between proposed activities and rain. And here is indeed routinely attribute to speakers these kinds of assumptions, the assumptions that the speaker must be making in order for that utterance to be broadly cooperative, to be relevant, to be coherent with prior content, to be adequately informative, and so on. And the general picture we have about the projection of background contents is that they involve this kind of process of attributing to the speaker the assumptions that are required to render the speaker cooperative. So at a very high level, this is how we would describe the proposal, that the projection of non-anaphoric content is pragmatically driven. And it arises through a process whereby the listener is trying to simultaneously construct an interpretation for the utterance and a context that the speaker is assuming, that jointly increase the pragmatic plausibility or utility of the utterance. This idea has been developed more formally in very recent work by Alex Warstadt. He gave a talk on this at the Amsterdam Colloquium just last month, explaining projection as a consequence of pragmatic reasoning about utterance utility. So the example that Warstadt takes, the sort of central example that he discusses, involves the genus-species presupposition originally identified by Abush, 2002. So these are implications from things like somebody tells you Fluffy's not a spaniel, you might infer that Fluffy is a dog, or tells you Jane doesn't have a green card, which is US permanent residency. You might infer from that Jane is not a US citizen. Or the example that he discusses here, somebody tells you, tell me something about Tom. Well, he's not an Olympic sprinter. You might infer that Tom is an athlete, or why. So here is how Warstadt explains this. He says, Olympic sprinters are so rare that there's almost no utility in asserting that Tom is not an Olympic sprinter in a typical context. So in fact, if I do say, tell me something about Tom, he says, well, he's not an Olympic sprinter. And we go, that's really not an informative thing, because I really had no reason to believe that he would be. But if you think the speaker did intend to tell you something informative, there might be something that the speaker is assuming about Tom and perhaps expects you to also know. And that is that Tom could be an Olympic sprinter. So for instance, the speaker might be assuming a context in which Tom is an athlete of some kind. So in Warstadt's account, the pragmatic listener attributes to the speaker the assumption that Tom is an athlete. And as I said, Warstadt has a formal system, an RSA-based system in which he derives this result, building on, on some prior work. So this account explains in a very general way why projection occurs. And note that in this account, projection amounts to accommodating the speaker, accommodating an assumption that the speaker appears to be making. But the account doesn't explain particular regularities associated with particular predicates. So to approach this question, I'm going to cite another authority, this time Stolnacker from 1974, who says, the propositions that P and the Q may be related to each other and to common beliefs and intentions in such a way that it's hard to think of a reason that anyone would raise the question whether P or care about its answer unless he already believed the Q. So, and this is a quote from Stolnacker that I've been citing for more than 20 years. And I think it has something important to tell us, that sometimes we simply, in order to make sense of why a person has said what they have said, we have to make assumptions about what they antecedently believe. And there may be specific between proposition relations that guide those inferences. So this is what we would like to add to Warstadt's proposal, precisely that there are certain particular between relation propositions that create defaults for accommodation. And what we claim specifically is that one such relation is that of ontological dependence. Right? So if a speaker raises the question of whether P, for example, by asserting not P, preconditions of the event type described by P are particularly natural or salient candidates for carrying out the kind of pragmatically driven domain restriction that is proposed in Warstadt's account. And one piece of evidence for this is that if the background question or context provides us with an alternative reason why the speaker has said what they have said, then the projection of the expected projection goes away. And this is something that Craige and I, together with David and Judith, have talked about elsewhere, but let me give you a couple of examples. Imagine a conversation like this. He says, Jane believes the code will work. Does she know for sure that it'll work? No, she doesn't. And clearly both A and B in their second utterances are not presupposing, do not take one another to presuppose that the code will work. And notice that we're in a context where it's already established that Jane has a particular belief about the code. This already adequately restricts the context. So allowing the question of whether Jane's belief is mere belief or knowledge to become informative. Here's another example. C and D are looking at an application for some position. C says the applicant isn't currently in college. Has she recently left college? Perfectly fine. Does not carry the implication that the candidate had previously been in college. In fact, this is a way of asking that question. Again, we've fixed the context in a slightly unusual way of now we take the end state to hold, and so we can use the leave college as a way of asking about the start state. And just in case you're thinking that maybe what's going on in D is that the focus of the question is recently, notice that if we switch it to D prime, the applicant isn't currently in college. Has she left college recently? Now it no longer sounds good. This is another example illustrating the same kind of thing with the precondition associated with it, with a selectional restriction. So I see I need to move on a little faster. So here's a summary of what I've said so far. A cooperative listener. So we're used to talking about cooperative speakers, but we can also think about listeners being cooperative. And what it is to be a cooperative listener is to try to attribute to the speaker a cooperative communicative intention, broadly speaking. And doing this requires establishing the relevance and utility of the speaker's utterances. And these things are determined relative to a set of background assumptions. I would say the background assumptions of the speaker, but we can say the common ground if you prefer. And it's easier to make something relevant if you have some set of background responses, or sorry, background assumptions that this utterance is an addition to. And so our claim is that the projection of preconditions reflects attribution by the listener to the speaker of background assumptions, without which the relevance of their utterance would be deficient. Okay, so that's a story about why preconditions do project. But one of the important things about understanding projectivity is the fact that it doesn't happen all the time. And in particular, with these class C contents, they are known to be projective contents that are relatively amenable to suppression. So let's think about why that is. So the general picture that we have here leads to a prediction that one that I've already partly illustrated, that where projection would not improve utility or improve the pragmatic plausibility of the utterance, projection will not occur. So I already briefly illustrated this, but I'm going to give you 3 situations where projection, in fact, leads to pragmatic inconsistency, and hence is ruled out. And I'm going to show you then that filtering proves to be a special case where the utterance both rules out projection while providing an appropriate context for interpreting the utterance that makes non-projection plausible. Again, just keeping an eye on the time. So here's a first set of cases. In situations where the speaker clearly lacks commitment to these potentially projective contents, projection doesn't happen. Because if it did, the result would be attributing some inconsistency to the speaker. So imagine this conversation. I heard John got drunk last night. I strongly doubt that. Mary would divorce him if she discovered he was drinking. So we observe that the speaker cannot coherently, simultaneously doubt that John got drunk and assume that John got drunk, hence no projection. This sort of non-commitment to the potentially projective content need not be explicit as it is in this example. An example that's been discussed many times in the literature involves, a couple of people talking about somebody who is a known stranger. He is acting kind of antsy and nervous. And so A says, maybe he just stopped smoking. That's how I behaved when I quit. And this can be said by A with no suggestion that the speaker is committed to it being true that the referent used to smoke. When I first talked about these examples, I called them explicit ignorance contexts. Craige has urged me that these are better called evident ignorance contexts or evident ignorance scenarios, because, as I just showed, that the ignorance need not be made explicit. Sometimes we have reasons other than recognizing the speaker's evident ignorance to avoid attributing beliefs to them. So here is another example of a different type. So suppose now we have two interlocutors, A and B, who are siblings. They have significant differences of opinion. They're aware of these differences, but they try not to get into arguments about them. So amongst other things, A firmly believes that aliens have visited Earth. B just as firmly disbelieves this. But on some occasion, A says to B, if it turns out that scientists have actually discovered that aliens built the pyramids, but the government has been keeping it secret, your whole worldview will have to change. So notice we have embedded in the antecedent, scientists have actually discovered that aliens built the pyramids. Now, the addressee, B, knows here that this is consistent with A's beliefs. Projection could happen without attributing inconsistency to the speaker. But we suggest that here A will not be so interpreted, and rather the assumption that aliens built the pyramids is intended to be understood under the scope of the conditional, under the scope of the antecedent of the conditional. One point to make clear here is that on our view, there is no need for any process of local accommodation. Local accommodation is needed in models where it is assumed that a contextual constraint has to be satisfied. And if it's not going to be satisfied globally, it has to be satisfied locally under the scope of the operator. On our view, there is no such constraint, hence no process of local accommodation. However, because discover entails the truth of its complement, it's obligatorily locally true, hence must be understood as part of the content of the antecedent. I'm going to skip over discussing the effect of at issueness, partly because it's been discussed at length in the literature, and I want to get to cartoon and filtering environments and their relation to speaker non-commitment. And I just want to give a shout out here to Florian. Craige and I first sort of floated some ideas about this in the Amsterdam colloquium talk, and Florian followed up, and thinking about what Florian has said has led to, I hope, an improvement on what we have to say here. So I'm going to here talk about the standard filtering environments involving conditionals and just disjunctions. They're familiar. And the idea is that these environments have two properties from a pragmatic perspective. First, the hearer cannot plausibly attribute to the speaker commitment to the truth of the precondition. So projection reading is pragmatically implausible. But in addition, the utterance itself provides a reason for the speaker to invoke this event type without prior commitment to the truth of its preconditions. So that's like the high-level picture. Let me illustrate with an example of each type. So consider an utterance of conditional in 1. If Sam was in her office today, she left. And what we're interested in here is the potentially projective implication from the consequent. There's an elided complement, but so she left her office. We expect projection, or we have potential projection of the precondition that Jane was in her office. But it never projects in this environment. Why not? Well, first, the conditional itself is evidence that the speaker is uncertain whether Sam was in her office. So in some sense, we have a case of evident ignorance. There are uses of conditionals like this where where we know that the speaker is in fact committed or already believes the antecedent to be true, and these are different. But here I'm just considering a more standard case of the use of a conditional. But there's something more going on than mere evident ignorance. The speaker who utters this conditional is also performing a speech act with the antecedent. Well, let me be careful how I put it. They're also, in uttering the conditional, the speaker is supposing that Sam left, and then asking the addressee, in effect, to consider the consequent in this suppositional context. So now, as listener, I can understand why the speaker would raise the question of whether Sam left her office without already assuming that she was in her office. The reason is that Sam wants to simply suppose this and consider its consequences. So the conditional is having two effects on our understanding of the role of that precondition. First, we learn that the speaker is not antecedently committed to it. They don't already believe it to be true. And second, we understand that they're doing this other thing that makes it sensible for them to raise the question of whether Sam was in her office without already assuming that she had been there. Now let's talk about the disjunction case. And I will say that it's harder to sort of tell the same kind of story about disjunction because I don't think we have quite the same understanding of how disjunctions work. But let's try and sort of spin this a similar kind of story. So now suppose the speaker says either Sam wasn't in her office at all today or she left. So first, the evident ignorance comes from the fact that the speaker has expressed as a disjunct the possibility that Sam wasn't in her office at all today. So clearly the speaker is not committed to the precondition of disjunct 2. Now, the felicity of the disjunction as a whole requires a number of things, including that both disjuncts are relevant to the same topic, or as I have put it before, are answers to a single question. But in addition, the disjuncts have to be distinct possibilities. So we can make sense of the speaker raising the question of whether Sam left in the second disjunct, and thereby entailing within the scope of the disjunct that Sam was in her office, as an alternative supposition to the possibility that Sam was never there. So again, the question that the listener is always asking themselves is, why would the speaker raise the question of whether Sam left her office if the speaker was not already assuming that Sam was in her office? Well, here's the answer. It's similar to the conditional case, in that this is a supposition, but it's also a supposition that we know must be distinct from the supposition in the first disjunct, which is a further reason to strengthen the idea that in the second disjunct, we're going to suppose the negation of the first. So there is certainly, this is all still quite preliminary, and hopefully we can discuss this, but I will leave that there. Okay, so summarizing part 3. The argument is that the projection of background contents is pragmatic, a matter of constructing an information state that renders the observed utterance conversationally plausible. And this leads to the claim that the suppression of projection is also pragmatic in nature. And we hope that by identifying at least one case of projective background contents as ontological preconditions gives us a starting point for understanding how these defaults arise. Okay, I'm going to take 2 more minutes just to talk about one thing that it's very evident to us still needs to be explained within our approach, And this is the gradients of projectivity. So this is there's been quite a bit of experimental work on this over the last few years. Most recently, a paper by Judith Daigle and Judith Tonhauser that just came out. We know that within a given class, so for example, within the class of factives, which is their focus here, there is gradients in projectivity. So this is this is the representation of their results, one set of results from their recent paper, where we can see that across the range of factive predicates, things differ in projectivity. But for example, discover and know different projectivity, but on our story, it's the case for both that the truth of the complement is a precondition. So why the difference? So what Daigle and Tonhauser suggest in their paper is that we have to look at fine-grained distinctions in the lexical meaning and discourse use of these different kinds of predicates. And we agree. And that's sort of what we need to do next. Specifically, differences in lexical content affect the likelihood of a predicate being relevant in a context in which its preconditions are not assumed true. This is the direction that we hope to look. I'm just going to float a question, which I think is not, and I'm curious about what Florian thinks about this. I'm wondering what the relation is between gradients, oops, there's a typo here, but gradients as reported in these papers that's derived from looking at basic projection judgments, and felicity of use in evident ignorance context. So one observation I made looking at this chart again is that discover is pretty high up on the scale of projectivity, but it's one of the easiest predicates to use in an evident ignorance context. It's really easy to suppress the projective meaning. So that's just a question. The other case that Craige and I are currently very interested in is the case of emotive factives, which are sort of, the opposite of discover. They are very strongly projective, and in evident ignorance environments, they tend to just give rise to infelicity. I have some speculative things here on the slide that I'm actually not going to go through because I think I should stop. But hopefully this is something we can talk about in the discussion. So there's a lot more work for us to do. We hope that we are on the way to a robust pragmatic foundation for the explanation of projectivity and projection. And I will stop here and thank you.
Thank you for the excellent talk. And Florian Schwarz is going to give us a commentary now.
Okay, so thanks for having me, and thanks for a great talk, Mandy and Craige. I'm looking forward to discussing, and I'm very happy to have the opportunity to comment here some. Let me keep an eye on time so I do try to stick to something reasonable. So first of all, just let me say that this is really inspiring and thought-provoking work and a really interesting take on projection. And I think especially the sort of explanatory potential for cross-linguistic regularities are really important and promising. I'm going to have just a little bit of a specific comment, and then I'll have some more general comments relating this to other work on projection that I've been having to sort of continue, I guess, our ongoing discussion that we already started after the Amsterdam colloquium and on other occasions on how these different lines of work might relate to one another. I'll in particular comment on some experimental results on very intricate projection patterns that I've had with a student of mine, Alex Calamoras. And then also I want to sort of bring up some general questions about the type of data we consider and the relationship between acceptability data and inference data in particular. One specific comment, nothing big and no particular issue, but just something I want to raise because I feel like it seems like an important point to consider, is that Of course, it's important, entirely agree, and I think it's a strong voucher if you count that it can do that, to capture the sort of cross-linguistic non-arbitrariness of these precondition type triggers. But I do have two related questions that I think are worth talking about. One is just at a very general level, right? Just because we may want to argue that something is not an arbitrary lexical fact, right? To what extent does that have to push us towards saying it's not a lexical fact at all? Might there be some non-arbitrary lexical facts? And perhaps somewhat relatedly, based on your account, if we had any potential individual examples that we can argue to involve equivalent truth conditional content and the same types of preconditions, but without the relevant presupposition, is that going to be a real big problem for your account? A candidate case, it's been discussed, and you may have other things to say about this, and maybe there's others, right? There's something like be right, which I think on my first pass at least passes the precondition diagnostics you offer, but at least traditionally is considered veridical and not factive, and therefore a different case. So this is just sort of one small comment. Turning to the main point, and this picks up on the discussion that Mandy was already partly responding to from emailing that we had back and forth, is relating the way that the proposal on the table here sort of lumps together different cases of non-projection. And I want to present some potential challenges to that from data that illustrates varying acceptability across cases of non-projection from recent work, again, with my student, Alex Colomaras, his dissertation work. So we look in this ongoing work, partly reported already in some places, on projection from disjunctions. These are occurring inside of conditionals. Things are complicated. I'm not going to be able to show you the whole design, but in a nutshell, the way in which I think still see a potential challenge for what Mandy and Craige have to offer here is that we compare cases of non-projection, where in the one case you just have an explicit ignorance context, and another case we have the same type of explicit ignorance context, but also something that on a traditional view would be a case of filtering in disjunction. And crucially, we find differences in acceptability between the two. And that to me suggests that it's something we can very naturally capture, and that's how we frame it. If we distinguish cases of non-projection, namely filtering cases and local accommodation cases. But at a minimum, I think it's fair to say that on the view Mandy laid out here, that it requires some additional explanation, maybe beyond what we've gotten to so far. But I look forward to continuing discussion. So just by brief background, the types of stimuli that we look at in our experimental work, what we call the local accommodation condition. I'll put it in scare quotes here since we're not agreed upon what this is, right? But they're elaborate contexts. These were hard stimuli to make up, but they were precisely designed to, I think, meet the conditions that are relevant here. So I'll just quickly go through it. Fred takes up various hobbies, although occasionally he gives some of them up, worrying that he spends too much time on idle pursuits. I found a nice kit for a ship model, but it's pretty intricate. I don't know if Fred has ever done any ship modeling, so I thought if Fred has stopped building ship models, then this kit will not suit him. So we have a trigger stop here, change of state. I think from what I gather, but correct me if I'm wrong, what the account Mandy proposed would say here is clearly explicit ignorance tells you the precondition assumption can't hold globally. But I would argue the raising question of stopping of the relevant activity seems still well motivated because of these carefully constructed contexts, right? Is ship model building one of those things Fred tried and gave up? That's what we try to make this felicitous. So based on that, if that is roughly on target, a non-projecting interpretation should be acceptable. Moving on to disjunction cases, same exact context here, with slight addition that inside of the conditional, you have another disjunct that does the standard filtering job. So if Fred either has never built any ship models or has stopped building ship models, then this kit will not suit him. And so in a sense, we have a piling up of stories here that you can offer from your account. On the one hand, we have the same contextual explicit ignorance story as before, but in addition, we have the other disjunct doing what I think ultimately still amounts to the same job, right? So it is true that it's bringing it up more explicitly, but ultimately, it seems just we have an abundance of acceptability predictions in a sense. But it's not clear to me, I think still, although Mandy's had more to say here already, a little bit in the talk today, how these pieces should sort of give rise to an additive effect, right? Where the acceptability should be further boosted in the disjunction case. And that's sort of the main point I want to raise. Crucially, in our data, again, we find this difference. So highlighted here are the case with the disjunction filtering, as we call it, compared to the local accommodation, a clear acceptability contrast. And also importantly, right, so the disjunction cases are sort of on par with all the other cases where the presupposition is taken care of through support in the context, or there is no presupposition at all. So it's really sort of, that seems to be the ceiling level, and what we take to be local accommodation has a depressed level of acceptance there. So again, I think the accounts that distinguish filtering and local accommodation easily align with this. And it's less clear, at least to me still, what the precondition-based account has to say about this type of data. And I should also add this, there is lots of acceptability-based data that shows decreases in acceptability for local accommodation. So I think, again, at a minimum, these sort of case-by-case explanations of what's going on there are something on your to-do list, in a sense, right? At least not necessarily a principled problem, but something that has to be dealt with independently. So my general point here, as sort of to put forward, is that we ask, are there the same or different sources of non-projection in play in the two cases? I would argue this type of evidence leans towards different from this data. There's another component to that project, and again, I can't do justice to all the details, but I think it's also intriguing and another intricate aspect of how projection works. And this is that we look at variation in linear order effects across connectives. So in particular, we compare conjunction and disjunction. Again, just very briefly, we try in the latest version here to have very close comparisons between the two. So virtually the same context, minor adjustments for the difference of meaning between conjunction and disjunction. And then you have in the conjunction conditions, something very similar. Fred has only built simple models and has stopped building ship models, standard filtering type of stuff, basically. And as far as I can tell, in this sort of conjunction filtering case, the story would go similarly, whether it's embedded in a conditional or not, right? Although there it's maybe more of an issue. But again, I assume what one would want to say from your perspective is that it's a question of whether raising the question of stopping is well motivated, and it is because of that other conjunct in pretty much the exact same way as it is in the disjunction type of case in this sort of environment. And now what's interesting, and where the twist I think gets added, and what our data I think again make an interesting point to discuss, is sort of what happens with respect to the order of the relevant disjunctions or conjunctions, right? As far as I could tell, and maybe we can find a story of changing that, but at first blush, it seems to me that the story and the reasoning about well-motivatedness should be basically the same, regardless of the conjunct order. So here we just have the stop clause first and then the supporting one second. And more generally, any direction I can think of where linear order might play a role of some sort, so far, right, it's hard for me to see how such story would not apply in parallel to conjunction and disjunction examples because of the sort of same nature of the general line of explanation. And the key finding, though, in that paper that we report is that linear order has differential effects on filtering, as we frame it, for conjunction and disjunction, in that only disjunction allows sort of filtering from the second disjunct in that case. And I think the reason I want to bring up this data in this context is just to sort of throw into the mix of these different ways of exploring the boundaries of projection patterns, is that we find these very intricate patterns here in that data. And that seems to, in general terms, suggest that we need a pretty specific type of theory of projection. And so Alex in this dissertation lays out a theory along these lines, building on Schlenker. There may be certain trivalent perspectives that come out of this, but at least to date, to the extent that people have tried to wrestle with this, and it's hard, even on those accounts, to wrestle with it, but to the extent that those patterns have been captured, they seem to only work for accounts that are specifically about projection patterns and mechanisms, so to speak, and employ some notion of presuppositional constraints on local context, and that, again, distinguish between filtering and local accommodation. So I think that's sort of another type of general challenge to take into account when we look at all the data that's on the table in terms of evaluating this otherwise, of course, very intriguing and exciting general take on dealing with the filtering cases. So that's what I'd like to offer. And I'm probably, no, I still have a moment maybe. Let me finally just sort of bring up some even more general issues just about the relation between different judgment tasks and theoretical notions, because I feel like that's something important we should consider here. It's clear that the different types of accounts that we're considering, in a sense, each more directly relate to different types of data, right? So the contextual constraint type view very naturally relates to making predictions about acceptability judgments, because it's all about acceptability in context. A lot, maybe not all, but a lot of how you frame things has to do with sort of inferences, often framed in terms of certainty about speaker commitment, and a lot of the empirical work you've been involved in and by your collaborators involve that. And I think something I like to highlight in these sort of contexts is that we can't take any of these sorts of data completely at face value, and no task is perfect in any way. And we all, and this goes both ways, should take into account data from different types of tasks. But crucially, I think we need to remind ourselves, I guess, and always really stay on top of the notion that the judgment data itself is not going to be directly reflecting on theoretical concepts that underlyingly might be in play on one account or another. So I think when we talk about this global inference data, we want to make sure that that is not necessarily identical to presupposition projection. And equally, when we talk about unacceptability, that is not necessarily attributable to issues with how presuppositions relate to context. And I think it's particularly helpful often in resolving what do different empirical sets of data with different tasks tell us, to look at direct comparisons and especially find cases where we get discrepancies or apparent discrepancies in the results patterns, and try to understand what else might be in play, how we can relate the individual types of result patterns to our theoretical concepts. I think I won't have time for this, but so we have some general thoughts on this in earlier work in the Mandy et al. Paper. We look at both acceptability and inference data and try to make a case sort of as a side note that we think the acceptability data in that context at least gives us a more direct insight on projection, but that's just sort of an additional point I wanted to make. And then finally, given the sort of more indirect role of acceptability in a sense to the type of account you guys are considering, I just want to sort of re-up the notion of, the question of, would any actual case of unacceptability due to presupposition or projection that can't be argued away in separate terms, be sort of a genuine piece of counter evidence to your story? This could, of course, extend to global accommodation type of cases. So if, and that's a big if, right? By assumption, we can't find another way of explaining unacceptability in the given case. And we find data that shows these sorts of acceptability effects. Would that be genuine evidence against? So it's true, as you mentioned, it's been very hard to come by to get acceptability type of effects for global accommodation in particular, and that's definitely a challenge as you laid it out. But there are some cases, and so data from Thiemann et al. Here that I'm just plugging in here at the end is perhaps a candidate case in point. So there are some cases where decreases in acceptability are found certainly for local accommodation quite commonly, but even for global accommodation as well, and including for the types of triggers that you're looking at, like no and stop are part of the mix here. So I'm curious how you see that, and I admit that's in some sense hypothetical, and that we got to really agree that there's no other better explanation. That's always going to be a possibility, but just to sort of have a clear grounds for debate. So if one succeeded at that, would that be a knockdown issue for that type of perspective? That's the last question I want to raise. And with that, I'll stop because I'm well over the allotted time. Thank you. And I look forward to discussing.
Thank you, Florian. So Mandy, now you have some time to reply to Florian's commentary. After that, we will stop the recording and open the floor for broader discussion.
Okay, thank you, Florian, for those comments. I mean, it's really helpful. I think, and there's a lot to respond to. And Craig pinged me that actually she would like to say something about something you said at the very beginning about lexical, that, you know, well, I'll let Craig just go. Craig, you're muted.
How about that? Thanks, Florian. I concur completely with Mandy. Even before today, your comments and interactions extremely valuable. So the first thing I want to comment, if you go back to your slide, I think it's slide 2, where you talked about is the account that we're giving, pragmatic account, incompatible with there being some lexical component of the projectivity. And you gave the example of be right. Or maybe it's the next slide. Yeah, there it is. Slide. Yep. So first of all, just about be right. Let me say that what is arbitrary, and let's compare be right with no, which is the projective versus the non-projective versus projective predicate with respect to the truth of the complement. That what is arbitrary about a lexical item in general is what is the main semantic content, or what I call the proffered content of the predicate. And in the case of no versus be right, completely arbitrarily, the difference is that the truth of the complement is part of the proffered content, I would argue, of be right, whereas it's not in the case of no. And we could argue about what the proffered content of no is, but I think if it were proffered, then you could target it directly. You would not expect it to be projective, etc. And lots of arguments have been given about that. So whatever the veridicality, however the veridicality arises, it is part of the proffered content of be right, and it's questionable whether it is in the case of no. That being the case, what we're talking about is projectivity of non-proffered content. And in the case of the change of state verbs, etc., it's clear that, again, the pre-state is not directly part of that proffered content by most measures of what's proffered versus not. So there is a lexical component in that particular case. Moreover, and what I'm about to say is more my point of view than Mandy's. We don't agree about every single thing about this account. I think it's quite plausible that when something is what we've called background content, and these ontological preconditions are background content, then there is a respect in which that is part of the information that interlocutors have about the broader character of the semantics and pragmatics of the lexical item, and that background, the sense in which that's background content is known. It's pragmatic, it's not arbitrary, it's not part of the semantic content or proffered content, but it is known about the lexical item, and that might give you a tendency to precompile the projectivity. I don't dispute that. But the fact that there are differences between the different classes strongly argues that there's more to it than just saying background content projects. So that's what I wanted to say about that point. Mandy, is there anything you want to follow up about that?
There's something else that I wanted to say, if I may, about the question you raised, this issue of if just because it's not arbitrary doesn't mean it's not linguistic or not encoded anywhere. And so I actually have fairly strong feelings about this. Right? So I think so. I have the paper that. One of the papers Dan mentioned in his introduction, paper I wrote with Kevin Zollman, I can't even remember when, in Philosopher's Imprint, developing the notion of a natural convention. So I do think that all kinds of norms and regularities about language are things that may have pragmatic explanations, practical real-world explanations, And they may well become part of our linguistic convention. And I don't have any problem with that. And I think one thing that's interesting about invoking a notion like precondition is it may show us how to unify cases. Let's say that the projective implication of no is conventionalized. But clearly the projective implications of these novel non-linguistic triggers that Thieu et al. Talk about are not conventionalized, but maybe we can still find the connecting explanation between them. That's my thought on that. Craige, is there anything else you want to talk about?
Not at the moment. Go ahead. There's more important things, and I think you know what you what we want to say about some of these matters. Yeah.
It always makes me worried when Craige thinks that I can read her mind.
No, we've talked about this, Mandy. Come on.
So, well, I don't know. You might consider this wimping out. I don't want to use up all of the discussion time because I really want to hear what other people have to say. I mean, I think it's really helpful to have these detailed, especially experimental results brought up and be pushed to think about them. And clearly the challenge that the kind of approach that Craige and I are drawn to, these very use-based, pragmatically driven approaches, always face this challenge of how do you fully generalize this? How do you demonstrate the systematicity and rule governance of it? And I think that's really what we want to do. So I mean, the story that I told about filtering in conditionals and disjunctions, that's very preliminary, and it kind of looks like it's an item-based explanation. But what I was trying to do in when I introduced the cases was say, look, these are the general features that characterize all of these cases. Any case, the filtering structure that we're familiar with from conditionals is always going to display these properties, and something about the disjunction case. And I think that we are that this is going to allow us to say to identify how the filtering configurations systematically, pragmatically differ from the standard evident ignorance context. But for sure, there's a lot more work to do here, and yeah, I just hope we can do it. So Craige, is there anything more specific you would like to say here?
There's one more thing about, this is about the last, one of the last slides that Florian, that you put up about the relation between judgment tasks and theoretical notions. First, I'm sure that Mandy and I completely agree with you about that. These judgment tasks, just like our diagnostics that we offer here, are just rough ways of trying to get at interlocutors' intuitions, and the theoretical explanation of those intuitions is a far different matter, and you don't get at that directly via these tasks or via the diagnostics. So we completely agree about that. But I want to point out that an awful lot of the time, the acceptability judgments are derived with respect to examples given with no prior context. And I think that's a real problem in that literature in general, because the out of the blue context, as if you're overhearing something, let's say, is a specific kind of context. And it leads to certain kinds of accommodation, et cetera, that you wouldn't normally find when you gave it in the right kind of context. So until you control for that, the acceptability judgments are skewed in a way that I often take issue with. But that's a larger discussion, but I just wanted to make that point because I think it's extremely important. We're talking about pragmatics, which is about acceptability in context. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I was trying to, refrain from talking too much because I already talked a lot, but just on those last couple of points, if I may. So one, I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. I understand you guys have, a reflected view on these sorts of things, and yet I think I did think it's good to raise so with regards to the context, again, entirely agreed with you, and the data that I reported here, right, had these very carefully and pretty intricate contexts. And I do think that's very important, and separate work with Alex Goebel, who I think might be here, or at least was here earlier. Right. We've also seen that some other earlier findings on local accommodation, I think, are including ones of my own, were maybe somewhat misleading because they weren't presented in context, and once we present them with context, you get a slightly different picture there. But a final point, and this is, I forgot to mention this earlier, and Mandy had flagged to me that she was going to bring up the topic of sort of gradient projection and variation across triggers. I think in that regard, from my perspective, this is one of the reasons I think this point is extremely important, in that in some of the relevant papers, my impression often is that there is a very direct inference being made from gradients and variation in judgments about certainty of speaker commitment to variance and projection. I think it's one of those points where at least one alternative perspective is to say that there may be something specific about the certainty of speaker commitment type of task that reflects that variability, and that does not need to map necessarily one-to-one to the underlying notion of projection. And at least in some cases, right, one could say, or it's not exactly that case, but somewhat relatedly, right, with acceptability data in context, for example, those in Mellon et al., we find sort of a more clear-cut contrast between relevant types of cases that seem to, sort of counter to some extent those impressions of gradient projection. So I think in that regard in particular, it's interesting to keep in mind that we want to look at our measures sort of critically and reflect on them, how they relate to the underlying context. Because regardless of account, and there's lots to be explained too from a more standard perspective, variation, and whether we see it as variation in productivity or variation in availability of local accommodation, we all have lots of explaining left to do to account for those things, right?
Okay, thank you to our speakers and discussants.